Hello, my name is Emma Sky. I'm sorry I can't be with you today in Thessaloniki, but I hope you're having a really interesting international symposium. My talk today will be on the Iraq War, and it's a war that I'm very familiar with, having spent a good number of years there with the coalition. The invasion of Iraq was based on the premise that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and that was an assumption that proved to be wrong. So the war should never have happened. But nothing that happened in Iraq after the invasion was inevitable. There were high hopes of a world without Saddam Hussein's and missed opportunities to create a better order. The coalition made a couple of decisions which had lasting effect on the country. And those decisions were de-Baathification, which removed all the top civil servants, and dissolving all the security forces. And this basically led to the collapse of the state. I don't think any country could have survived a foreign invader dismissing all their servants and removing all their security forces. And in that period, when there was a power vacuum, a security vacuum, Iraqis formed gangs to protect themselves. And those who had worked before for the regime started to became insurgents and started to attack the new people that the coalition put in power and to attack the coalition. And because the borders of the country were left unguarded, it meant that anybody who wanted to go and fight the so-called infidel in Iraq could come through the borders, and that led to a number of jihadis coming in. So in the chaos of the civil war, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was able to find a following. It was led by a guy called Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and he attracted to him a number of people, a number of Iraqi Sunnis and a number of people who came from outside the country. And Zarqawi's strategy was to attack Shia, ordinary Shia, government officials, Shia symbols. He wanted to provoke a civil war in order to collapse the state so that then he could replace it with a caliphate. And his beheadings, his suicide bombings, all of these attacks that he ordered on the Shia population were horrific and even led to a rebuke from bin Laden, who said that what Zarqawi was doing was giving Al-Qaeda a bad name. So Zarqawi was originally an affiliate of Al-Qaeda Global, but then he set his own path to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. He was eventually killed in 2006, but by that stage, after the bombing of the Samarra Shrine, the civil war had gained momentum in the country. The violence in Iraq came down dramatically during that period that we call the Surge, which was from 2007 to 2009. And it was quite an extraordinary period because when you look back at the end of 2006, the country really looked lost. It was mired in such levels of violence. Every day in Baghdad, there'd be dead bodies in the street, and you can tell if they were Sunni or Shia just by the way in which they had been killed. But President Bush gambled, if you like, to send in extra forces. And it was, most of his advisors said, Iraq is lost, get out. But he took the calculation that if the US withdrew under such circumstances, what was happening in Iraq would really spill over and affect the whole region. So he sent extra forces into Iraq. And a new strategy was put in place. It wasn't just about going after the bad guys, going after the terrorists. It was much more focused on protecting the Iraqi people from the terrorists. And at the same time, out in the west of Iraq, in Anbar province, there were Sunni tribes that started to turn against Al-Qaeda and realign with the United States, with the US military. So this became known as the Sunni Awakening, and this spread across Baghdad and through other areas of the country. And it it brought about a dramatic decline in the number of attacks on the Shia population. And when the Shia population saw that they weren't being targeted so much by Al-Qaeda, they became less willing to accept the different Shia militias that were controlling Baghdad by this stage. And so they withdrew their support from the Shia militias, and the Shia militias then had to stop their activities and disband. And the Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, with pressure from the US, was targeting not just Sunni extremists, but also Shia extremists. And he started to appear much stronger as a leader, and people really felt that the country was moving in the right direction. And so by 2009, people thought, Iraqis thought, Americans thought, that the civil war had ended. So why did it all unravel? In the national elections in 2010, there was very, very high turnout. People wanted to believe that the civil war was behind them. And some insurgents or former insurgents actually ran as candidates. And people who had boycotted the elections before turned out in high numbers. And a coalition came together called Iraqiyya that was led by Ayad Alawi that campaigned on a platform of no to sectarianism and Iraq for all Iraqis. And this bloc went on to win the most seats in the election. It won 91 seats. It attracted the support of Iraq's Sunnis, Iraq's secular Shia, Iraq's minorities. But Nouri al-Maliki, the incumbent, refused to believe the result. In the Middle East, people don't usually lose elections. That was quite something. And so he claimed that there was fraud. He demanded a recount. He tried to disqualify the candidates and the votes of his competitor, Ayad Alawi. But the result still stood. And during this period, there was a big disagreement within the US system over what to do. There were those who believed that the US should support the right of the winning bloc, Iraqiyya, to have first go at trying to form the government. And there were those who said, look, Nouri al-Maliki is our man. Iraq's not ready for democracy. Iraq needs a Shia strongman, and he'll allow us to keep troops in Iraq after 2011, when the existing security agreement expired. And so it went back and forth, and in the end, the US decided to maintain support for the incumbent, Nouri al-Maliki, even though he hadn't won the most seats in the election. Now, this caused a lot of problems. Maliki grew much closer to the Iranians, and in his second term, securing his seat, what he did was go after the Sunni politicians, accusing them of terrorism and forcing them to flee the country. He reneged on his promises to the Sunni tribal leaders who had fought against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and some were arrested, some fled, and some were killed. And there were mass arrests of Sunnis. There were protests and mass arrests, and these arrests were put down violently. And what this did was create the conditions for the Islamic State, ISIS, to rise up out of the ashes of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which had been defeated, and claim that it was the defender of the Sunnis against the Iranian-backed sectarian regime of Nouri al-Maliki. And some of the tribal guys, they looked at ISIS and they looked at Maliki, and they decided that ISIS was the lesser of two evils. So that kind of explains the conditions that led to the rise of ISIS. There would have been no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, there would have been no ISIS if it wasn't for the Iraq War. But the Iraq War didn't have to go the way that it did go. So thank you very much for your time. And if you want to know more about what happened and why, please have a look at my book, The Unraveling. Thank you.